My next guest on the podcast is Javier Marin, the author of new book Live from America: How Latino TV Conquered the United States. Javier follows the evolution of the Spanish International Network, which is now known as Univision. Live from America unravels the personal intrigues, hidden tensions, power plays, and the cultural shifts behind the media empire, revealing how its programming from the telenovelas to the soccer to the news to the music reshaped and re-identified the audience at the time as well as the landscape in the US. It speaks of decades of speak-only English movement, suppression of Spanish in schools, and CBS's efforts to block programming. Javier explains how the US became the world's second largest Spanish speaking country, how Univision became a power political engine, and how Spanish language media has always faced censorship. He explores how Ronald Reagan used the network to announce Hispanic Heritage Week, speaking in Spanish on air, and how he expanded the week to what we now know as the Hispanic Heritage Month. The book also reveals the behind-the-scenes diplomatic maneuvering that shaped Univision's control and its role in the U.S.-Mexico-U.S. relations. Stories that remain strikingly relevant today, right? So you'll hear a lot about us relating events that happen in his book during our conversations. Please help me in welcoming Javier Marin into the Latinx Business Podcast Show. Hi, Javier. Thank you for coming on to the Latinx Business Podcast Show. How are you doing this morning? Or yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, Randy, and I'm very happy to be in your show.
Yes, thanks. Yes. Over the weekend I was reading your book, and then I was also reviewing the notes. So we'll just get right into it. I know that you're an entrepreneur and you also have a ton of things going on. So thank you for your time today in advance. But yeah, first question, and we ask all of our guests, what's your preferred pronoun?
He, him.
He and him. Okay, we'll go by those. And then, and one question that I always ask all my interviewees on the show is, what part of Latin America are you from? Like, what are your origins?
Yeah, I was born in the city of Maracaibo in Venezuela.
Okay, Venezuela. My next question for you would be, what inspired you to write Live from America, and why did you feel this was the moment to tell the inside story of the Spanish language television in the U.S.?
Yes, let me answer two questions, because first, the book was not, the origins of the idea of doing the research was never to publish a book. It was for my personal use. When I decided to enter into the Spanish media ecosystem, I decided to do a research on the most successful business-wise media conglomerate in the U.S., which is obviously Univision.
Yes.
So we're talking about maybe about 24 years ago when I started doing research on the history of Univision and their main, their basics, foundations, and at the same time the evolution of the company and how they became a multi-billion-dollar company. And at the same time, I found a fascinating story, a fascinating saga of not only business growth but also impact in a growing community, an exponentially growing community. And then in year 2010, I decided to give a lecture at Tufts University in Boston about the history of Latin American media, and that ended with the history of Univision. And it was very well received. And that's when I realized that was a story that was not well delivered. And that's when, in my mind, started to thinking about publishing. And right before COVID, I decided to publish the story. Still impressed that no other books was explaining the real saga behind the story of Univision.
Yes. Okay. So then you traced the evolution from Sin to Univision, right? What was the biggest turning point that transformed it from a small network to a media powerhouse in the US? I mean, I have to say, I think growing up, and I'm going to be 40 this year. So growing up, I think the only thing we watched, and I grew up in East Los Angeles. So, my parents, a big Mexican Spanish-speaking community. Even to this day, I want to say my mom doesn't really have a need to speak English. She understands everything we say, but we grew up with Univision in the mornings, Univision in the afternoons, after we did our homework, right? Like Univision was the only network out there until, I mean, I don't really know details in terms of like Telemundo and stuff like that, right? But when Telemundo hit the scene, I guess you would say. But yeah, I just remember Univision was the only channel you would go to and watch Spanish speaking language and Spanish news and El Gordo y la Flaca and like, Sábado Gigante every like weekend and stuff. But yeah, in your own words, when can you trace the evolution from Sin to Univision and when did it become a big powerhouse in the US?
Yes, the evolution of Univision is in parallel with the evolution of the Hispanic community in the U.S. If we go back to the 1960s and 1970s, we're talking about 3.5 million Hispanics and Spanish-speaking people in the U.S. Only 3.5. Then in the 1980s, it went up to 15 million. Wow. So Univision was not called Univision at the beginning. There was a small TV station in San Antonio, Texas, called SIN, Spanish International Network. And the Mexican family, Azcárraga, the owners of what is now Televisa, the second generation of that company, Emilio Azcárraga Vidaurreta, El León, had the vision that the community of Mexico was going to keep emigrating to the U.S., for certain reasons that I explain in the book.
Yeah.
And so he knew that the immigration from Mexico to the U.S. was going to keep growing. He was short on his projections. He thought it was going to be 10 million, 15 million. Right now, in 2026, we are 62.1 million. So
wow.
When...
from the 70s, yeah.
From the 70s, yeah. I mean, in the 80s, we were 15 millions. In the 90s, went up to 22, then 2035, and it went that way. But at the beginning, so the small Spanish TV station in San Antonio, this family from Mexico decided to invest and buy not the entire station, but a majority of the station. And there was the first obstacle, which is there was a law in the United States where, remember, in the 70s and 60s, there was no cable, no internet. So there was only three big TV networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. That's it. So this Mexican investor had the vision and the idea, the innovative for those times, to start buying a small TV station. They were called low-power TV stations in different cities where Mexicans were emigrating. And so there was this law. It was the first obstacle in order for, have the restrictions for big corporations to start new networks. So there was only three, a triumvirate of ABC, CBS, and NBC. And so there was this law that restrict any foreigner to own more than 25% of a TV network. So that was the first wall they got in front of their investment. But they went around it. The Azcárraga had an employee in Mexico who was born in the suburbs of Boston. His name was Reynold Vincent Anselmo. Yes. And so they sent Anselmo to the U.S. They gave him convertible loans, all the details in the book. And so he was the front man of the Mexican family to go around that it was called the 20% rule, but it was actually giving up to 25% of ownership of TV networks. So in that way, they went around that law. They started to buy different small TV stations. And then in order to connect those small TV stations, I forgot to say, that small TV station in San Antonio was Spanish-speaking, and most of the content was purchased from the Mexican family in Mexico. So there were Mexican movies and Mexican shows, and they didn't have much resources in San Antonio. So so that's the way they grew the network. And then the population, the Mexican population, and then the Cubans in Miami, and then the Puerto Ricans in New York and Dominicans, and started to, populate Hispanic America. And there was the government of Ronald Reagan. Actually, before, the government of Richard Nixon was the one who commissioned a committee to decide to put a word on everybody that speaks Spanish in the U.S. So Nixon said, I don't want to hear from the Cubans, from the Mexicans, from the Puerto Ricans. I just want to see just one group. And that's how officially Hispanic was the terminology used by the U.S. And that helped the government to develop that voting machine of the Hispanic vote. And that helped to develop corporate America, to develop the Hispanic market as a prosperous community. So it was a building of not only the Mexican family, of not only the founders of the San Antonio station. It was a work done by the government and corporate America to build this economic and political engine. And in the 1980s, when we were already 15 million people, that's when Ronald Reagan, who was the former governor of California, remember, so he was aware of the potential voting machine. So he did the amnesty to 2 million Mexicans to get their documents, and at the same time he supported that was built under the nose of the other three. And also at that time, for example, Rupert Murdoch in 1985, he became American citizens in order to try to build the fourth network. So the fourth network in the U.S. was a Spanish International Network. And it became so powerful that in the book, I explain how the government forced the Mexican family to sell their shares. So more or less the same thing that happened with TikTok now.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's so parallel worlds with what's going on right now in current times.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that's the turning point in 1980s when the government forced the Mexican family to sell it. They sold it for a little bit more than almost $500 million, which was a big sum for those times. And it was forced to sell the shares to Hallmark Cards, which is Hallmark Cards, the card company. They didn't have a TV station then. A company from Missouri that had nothing to do with the Hispanic community.
Oh man!
And that's when they changed the brand from Univision, from a Spanish International Network to Univision. And that at the same time, Telemundo was also being expanded to national. Telemundo was a TV station in Puerto Rico, and it was purchased by another American group of investors and decided to expand it nationally at the same time, or more or less 1987.
Like in around the same time frames. Okay, gotcha. Yes. Okay. So yeah, for me, that's man, it's so relevant and current to what's going on now, right? With TikTok, and they're like, no, it's Chinese owned, and it shouldn't be Chinese owned, or at least the app in America should be American owned. So very interesting how politics plays into this. And I think, you allude to that a lot, and you mentioned that a lot in your forward, and then even your epilogue and stuff like that. And, you think that you're free in America to do what you want to do, but you can't really, create a whole network without it being regulated. Right. And that's to me, that doesn't sound like the American dream, but, to some degree, I guess that's how it is here. So I get that. And I mean, from those times, what is some of the most intriguing or power plays, scenes that you remember that from the book that you can share with us, and for the audience to listen to you right now? What would be the most surprising or dramatic story you can mention at the moment from those 19?
Well, the corporate way of thinking of the Mexicans, wealthy moguls, and the corporate way of thinking of big corporate America in the U.S., the English-speaking world against the Spanish-speaking world, was surprised for me to see how, at the end, they were able to build something together, even though with a lot of clashes, a lot of differences between both cultures. But there was a way to do it. There was a way to build it, and that was part of this fascinating story. For example, I'll give you an idea. Satellite TV. Satellite TV was only in the hands of governments back in the 70s. So there was a monopoly of satellite transmission, which was called Intelsat. And Intelsat was owned by different governments. And that's it. It was like telecommunication was also a monopoly in the U.S. by AT&T. And so because of those monopolies, the Mexican group couldn't, take advantage of that interconnection that I said about building the fourth network. So this guy, Reynold Anselmo, was a character. There is an entire chapter in the book about him. So he would do everything he could in order to convince the government to privatize the satellite transmission. He together with several activists, they found a way to convince the FCC and the government to privatize the satellite transmission. And the first individual to finance individually a rocket. I mean, like the Elon Musk of this years,
Yeah.
with his own money, was Reynold, Vincent, and Selmo. The money he received when the sales force, when he was forced to sell SIN, he put all the money in a rocket
Hmm.
with his own satellite. He called it Simon Bolivar. And with that rocket, he built a company that was called PanamSat that connected most of Latin America and Mexico and the US. But you would say that's an American technology, there was an American philosophy, but no. Reynolds learned about the satellite, the commercialization potential of satellite transmission with Mexico. 70,
Yeah.
the Soccer World Cup played in Mexico was the first World Cup transmitted live in color, in full color, to the entire world from Mexico. So it was Televisa
Yeah.
who convinced the government, because they had a very tight relationship with the government of Mexico, to do this transmission of soccer. That's when Anselmo realized the potential, the business potential of having that transmission around. That was actually the first time people in the world could watch Pelé playing live in color.
Oh,
It
wow.
was his last
Yeah.
World Cup. He played fourth World Cup. So it was in his last World Cup when the entire world really knew the icon he was in soccer.
And they could see him like in picture format. I guess before that, the only thing you would have would be like printed photography that people would look at.
Or delayed transmissions in black and white. Yeah.
Delay transition, black and
So
white. Okay.
so
Yeah.
then Anselmo built PanamSat. So I'm telling you that story because it gives you the idea of how much risk these people put in their dreams.
Oh my
Nobody
goodness. Yeah. They're
nobody will
trailblazers.
thought that a
Yeah.
fourth network in the U.S. was going to be Spanish speaking. Nobody thought that a guy with his own money will launch a rocket and put a satellite owned by him in the U.S. Sorry, in the space.
Yeah.
And then another story of Anselmo in '81, the antennas that transmitted the TVs in New York were moved from the Empire State to the World Trade Center, to the Twin Towers.
Okay.
And that move was subsidized. So it was paid by the government. The government paid the TV networks to move their antennas from Empire State to the World Trade Center so people could watch the TV. At that time, that was the Air TV. It was free TV right now. And you know what Anselmo did? Because the government, of course, subsidized the three big networks and didn't subsidize the Spanish international network.
Of course.
So he
Yeah.
did a hunger strike.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In the parking lot of the Twin Towers, he put a container, like those constructions type of portable offices they do on construction projects,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
because he had a lot of money. And actually, I was being interviewed by a person in Texas who said, I'm pretty sure he's the only CEO in the history of the U.S. that have done a hunger strike.
Oh, wow.
And
That's pretty
and
impressive.
so he did the hunger strike just to claim that the Hispanic community was being discriminated by not having those antennas moved to the World Trade Center. And if you want to hear what happened, just the book tells you all the details.
The
And
book tells you all the details. Yes. We don't want to give
I,
up
I,
too many
I had
details,
the
right?
luck of knowing and interviewing his lawyer, who was with him several hours during that hunger strike.
During that hunger strike. I know we'll leave it to the book so people could go out there and get the book, of course. So yeah, but my next question is, so you document decades of speak only English movements, right? Speak only English. So I hear those three words and it just like it really resonates with me because I grew up learning about these movements and stuff, and the suppression of Spanish in our schools. How has those tensions shaped the Latino media in the U.S.? From your point of view, how do you see that those tensions
Yes.
have shaped what we've
Well,
seen?
yes, it's good to explain that this has been a cycle. Several presidents have been pushing the idea of having only English speaking in the country. We can go back to the beginnings of this, the modern society, when
Yeah.
Theodore Roosevelt was the first president who said there is only one language in the U.S. and etc. But he couldn't make it a law because the Constitution of the United States does not have an official language. So the Spanish-speaking media was a catalyst for the the construction of the Spanish speaking, the growth of the Spanish speaking culture. But we have to go to history. If we go back to 1848, and Mexico lost the war with the U.S. and had to give Arizona, Nevada, Texas, California, part of Wyoming, and part of Utah. But the rendition was a treaty called Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in Mexico City, in the La Basilica de Guadalupe. And that treaty had a condition signed by the U.S., which was, we're going to allow the use of Spanish, and we're going to allow the Mexican culture to still be in those territories. So it was different than, for example, Philippines, or where they had the obligation to change their language to English. Over here, since the 1800s, the U.S. officially allowed the use of Spanish. But there have been presidents. Our current president has said several times that English speaking is the language to be used. But it has been a cycle. And if the times when the Hispanic community were 3 million, they couldn't imagine with 62.1 million. I mean, you will have to sink Puerto Rico in order to prohibit the use of Spanish. And at the same time, the Spanish-speaking media has been an important pillar for the use of the language. And Univision, you would say, was the resistance pillar for that culture. Not only the Spanish newspapers, who were very regional, radio stations who were very regional, but the national reach was through Univision and Telemundo.
Gotcha. Yeah. That, you don't even sit down to think that, like, a network that has been around since the 70s is really pushing to maintain our cultural livelihood. Like our roots are, like I grew up speaking Spanish, right? So I cannot imagine a world where I grew up only speaking English, even though there are some Latinos that have grown that way because, I feel like it might be the generation before mine, but there are a lot of Latinos out there who don't know English too well. And they're kind of products of that era of when, like, speak only English, and their parents were like, no, like, learn English and only speak English at school because, we don't want you to get in trouble, and we want you to succeed, and we want you to move forward. But it's so different than now. Like, the only reason I say that is because, so my nephew's generation, he's 16, they love speaking Spanish since, like, they were little kids, and all their friends in high school not only speak Spanish, they listen to Spanish music. It could be urbano, it could be like tejano, it could be banda from, like, the north of Mexico. But that's not something that you saw. So I kind of seen 3 generations, the one before me that was speak only English, and then mine that was like, you don't really want to speak English in high school, but then when we all kind of, like, moved on to college, we're like, it's very important to know Spanish, especially with, like, my business. And I want to say, like, at least half of my clientele are Spanish speaking only clients. But then my nephew's generation now, I feel like times are changing, but like it's I just think about those numbers, right? 3 million, 2 million Spanish speaking Latinos in the US. It's a big culture change, and, like, that's a big powerhouse as well. But then I never really connected the dots of, like, how you're saying that the Spanish networks are really at the forefront of this movement to maintain our Spanish speaking culture and to move forward. It's a livelihood as well, But yes, sorry, I interrupted you, but you were going to say something.
Well, no, there has always been a force against the use of Spanish, always, and sometimes they get a lot of noise. And when we see people that, Latinos that don't speak English, we have to don't speak Spanish. We have to respect them, because there was a time where that fear of being suppressed or being discriminated or even being deported because of your accent and the use of Spanish, explained in the book some very drastic punishment that they did to kids in Texas for speaking Spanish at the classrooms.
Yeah.
So those created a big fear in families, and that's why we see a lot of one generation specifically that only speak English. So that's one of the reasons. But it has always been a cycle. So there have been the same amount of people that force the use of English. And I will tell you a good example. When they forced the sale of the shares, guess what? Rupert Murdoch and Ted Turner, the CNN founder, they wanted to buy that network, but of course, to convert it into English-speaking network. So everybody would ask, how come they kept the Spanish, even in the hands of Hallmark Cards, which was a Missouri company that I think obviously they wanted to convert that station also into English-speaking, and a lot of cultural forces from supremacists that would say this is restricting the use of Spanish on TV would also help the assimilation of the Anglo culture. So there
Got
was a
it. Yeah.
judge. There was a judge in California, Mariana Falser. A big part of the book was also talking about her. She was the one who managed the sale of Spanish International Network to Hallmark Cards. And she was the one who put the obligation to keep the Spanish language in the station for the next 17 years, which was the life of the license by the FCC. So if it wasn't for her, maybe Univision wouldn't exist, and we would have had a fourth network, CNN or Fox, that had to come later on through cable.
So pivotal. All these, they're not small decisions by any means, but like that, to put that language in the sale of the corporation, right? To have it be Spanish for the next 17 years. Like, I wonder if that language wasn't there, if any of these networks in Spanish would have survived. We don't know, right? Because that didn't happen. So that's very important information to keep like alive. So I'm glad that you have it in the book. I also feel like I was just thinking about something you mentioned earlier, Univision and Telemundo, right? They have, or at least to me, they're very different in the way that they approach the Spanish speaking media, or at least my own personal. I'm not going to say like as an expert, right? I'm going to say as myself as an individual. I think growing up with Univision, it felt like an extension of Mexico. Then Telemundo came in and it was like different for some reason. And I can't pinpoint what the difference is, except for maybe styles of recording. But then it makes sense that, one was developed here in the US, and then the other one was created by like investors from another country, right? But even in Mexico, when I go to Mexico and I see the news, like I love watching the news. I love hearing the news. I NPR every day. Like, I turn on the news media outlet every morning, even though I don't need to watch it every morning. Like, it's just, I watch Bloomberg, I watch CBS, I watch NBC. Like, whenever I'm traveling, like, I'm always very interested in how every media approaches their newscast style for some reason, because it talks to a different type of audience, every single one of them. And it attracts a different type of person. And an individual, at least for myself, I feel like an individual feels very connected to one or the other. So, but yeah, thank you for giving us a little bit of that background story. But I think just changing a little bit the dynamics of the interview today, and then also to focus a little bit about yourself and your businesses that you started. Tell me a little bit about the media outlets that you've owned for the last 25 years, and how has your personal experience as an owner shaped the way you approach writing this book, right? Like, how did you get into the business? Tell us your origins. So a little bit more background about yourself.
Yes, and I will relate it to the book, because actually the book is part of the research that I did to start my business. Live from America, How the Latino Conquered the TV, which is the name of the book, narrates how a Mexican family saw an opportunity. And the first question would be why the American networks didn't see that opportunity, right? The ABC, CBS, and NBC, why they didn't put Spanish programming to, if they would have done it, maybe, Univision and Telemundo didn't have a reason to exist, because everybody would speak to everybody and consider Hispanic America, even with a subsidiary, another TV station. So I will relate that to my life as well. When I came to the U.S. in the year 2000, and I decided to start a Spanish newspaper in Boston, Massachusetts. My first idea was to find a job in an English-speaking media and learn from that business model. Of course, it was very difficult with my accent, not being a native English speaker. I think that's the most difficult field to cross over, the Spanish-speaking media, for a Latino.
Media. Yeah.
Then I realized, wow, there is a huge newspaper called Boston Globe, and there is not a huge Spanish-speaking newspaper, which has already at that time close to 10% of the population, and there were certain cities where were very highly Hispanic, dense Hispanic. And so in the same way, how the Mexican family saw an opportunity, why the English-speaking didn't see this opportunity, I did the same with the Spanish media in a city that wasn't, in the top 5 for the Hispanic market. And it was very successful from day one with a business model of a Spanish media, advertising and business development, real
Wow.
journalism behind the news. So that's how I started a Spanish newspaper. Of course, then became internet, the whole digital, the same dilemmas for a big corporation and media, the same dilemmas
Yeah.
I had with a small Spanish speaking. And I had to tackle those in the same way a big corporation would do it. And the company is still there. It's being run by my second generation. My nephew is a CEO, and I have my niece in the finance and my son in business development. But the
Amazing. Yeah.
reason behind my decision to enter into that is, again, I saw an opportunity that the English-speaking world was not approaching for several
Right.
reasons. You can call it discrimination. You can call it, ABC, NBC, CBS
Right.
didn't want the Latinos to be prosperous because remember, this is a country, a very peculiar. Um, the immigrants community in this country is especially the Hispanic, is very different than any immigrant community in the world. I mean, there is no other country that has government supporting a network in other languages. Not even Arabic in France, not even Hindi, England. There's not. Here,
Interesting. Yeah.
remember, Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Florida, California was all Spanish speaking even before 1776.
Right.
So this was territory that was, sold, invaded, whatever you want to call it, colonized. But it was Spanish speaking. It kept being Spanish speaking. So there was this market. So you can call it racism or discrimination or just ignoring, but trying to diminish that important community didn't work because there was another force, not all Latinos. Remember, the government of Ronald Reagan wanted the Hispanic community, and then other governments, of course. I'm not saying that Reagan was the best. I'm just saying, that's a government that started valuing the Hispanic market as a prosperous.
Yeah.
Not because they want to be good to the Hispanics, just because it was another big voting machine and a big business. Economic
Yeah, I was going
engine.
to say, on top of being a big voting force, I just keep thinking about 60 million Latinos or Spanish speaking Latinos in the US. That doesn't even count the Latinos who, like you said, have grown up only speaking English, right? And they probably still feel very connected to our cultural roots. But yeah, no. So, okay, so you saw in Boston, there wasn't a Spanish newspaper outlet and you created one. And what about like the transitioning from so are you guys are online now? Like how did that work for you
Oh,
guys? Was that hard being a small business?
we purchased the Spanish newspaper of the Washington Post in Washington, D.C. When Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post, he decided to either close or sell several of their assets, but specifically the Spanish-speaking newspaper from the Washington Post, El Tiempo Latino, he decided to sell it to somebody that would sustain the media, and that's how I ended up owning El Tiempo Latino in Washington D.C. So the company grew into
Yeah.
two local outlets, one in Massachusetts, one in D.C. area that covers D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, and then the digital world came in. It came in with a huge disruption, and I will blame not only the technology but also our stubbornness to keep thinking that the digital world was not gonna go over us. And so I'm glad to say that I didn't do the what Blockbuster did, right? That Blockbuster owners told Netflix, we don't need you, we can do it ourselves. That's in the book of the history of Netflix. No, we as Tiempo, now the company is called Tiempo Company. You can check online. We decided to embrace the digital world. We had a lot of tough times when a lot of mom and pop and family-owned media businesses had to close or were sold to English-speaking media. We kept our passion and commitment to the journalism and good information to our local communities. And now we're seeing the good price of that risk taken during those times and that stubbornness of being a family-owned, that now it's a national news outlet called Tiempo. But we still have those two local outlets as well in Massachusetts and in Washington, D.C. So it's a good story, but it had a lot of suffering and a lot of risk taken, like any news media corporation, but in a smaller scale. And being minority owned, it also has some pros and cons.
Yeah, I
and
was
some
gonna
challenges.
say, I mean, being a small business owner right now, as I was talking to you earlier and I was mentioning, I run a tax and bookkeeping firm, right? So we're small, we're boutique, so we don't have a big staff, but it is a lot of work that we do. But also, I find it harder and harder every day with all these requirements that businesses have to upkeep, right? The state, the federal tax filings, the taxes, paying your employees, payroll taxes, sales taxes. If you're selling a product, it is hard. It's hard out there for a lot of small businesses to be successful at the moment. And I kind of I feel like and that's one of the main reasons why I started the podcast too, right? Because I was like, hey, I want to put this information out there for them. Like, how did you start? What are some of the challenges that you've had, and how did you overcome those? Because maybe someone out there that's listening is going to come across these challenges. So yeah, when I started the podcast, that was like the main reason in 2020 during the pandemic. And I think right now it's more about like information sharing, right? So if you could share, what is it like one story you could share from your personal entrepreneur business that you're like, hey, this was really tough financially, and then we overcame this by X, Y, and Z. Is there another story you could give us?
Yeah, the impact in the community when I was going to say forced, but mentally thinking about selling my newspapers to an English speaking media that I knew it was going to either move it south and not taking care properly of our readers, or close it, right? Doing some assets will be like private equity type of
Yeah.
philosophy. So when I had that dilemma, because remember, when the digital world came, it came disrupting the whole. I'll give you some figures. We used to sell, I don't know, $20,000 cash every week on classifieds. Then what's the name? Craigslist came with a free classified, and
Yes.
in a year, 20,000 went down to 2,000. Right.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that in a small business, what you thought it was the great part of owning a newspaper was a huge impact, a huge disruption in the industry, and many people just went out of business because people thought that the digital Craigslist was not gonna last, or there was trying to find ways to survive your current business model and not being flexible enough to understand that the innovation at that time, the innovation could last, could take about a year. Right now with AI, innovation takes weeks.
Yeah.
And so if you're not prepared, I don't know if that answers your question, but
No,
if you're
yes,
not
that's
prepared to
actually.
changes
Uh-huh.
on innovation and understanding that even generationally, I mean, when I realized that I was delaying the changes in my company, that's when I decided to step out of the day to day.
So, you know what? I do have a follow-up question because in order to complete the answer of that question, you mentioned that you went from 20,000 in ads weekly to $2,000 in sales.
Classified ads.
Classified ads. Okay, classified ads. What was the turning point where you were able to switch that over, and what was the digital embrace that you guys did in order to not go out of business, right? Because you maintain
Yeah,
in business, yeah. So my follow-up
that's
question is like, how did you overcome that?
a great question. That's
Yeah.
why I started answering with the word impact. If you make impact, I'm talking about my industry, right? If you make
Uh-huh.
impact with your content in your community, then the authorities, the corporate leaders will realize that your content is so important that will, support whatever you're doing in terms of maintaining your positive impact in the community. Think about COVID. When COVID came in 2020, if you didn't have Spanish speaking media, the whole tragedy would have been worse, because you had to communicate in your own language why to vaccine and why to tackle the misinformation. This is just one example, a very recent example.
Mm-hmm.
So the how do you say that, to keep trying, it's an entrepreneurial challenge, because most of the young entrepreneurs are thinking about exit strategies. Maybe I said wrong. It's not young against the old.
Yeah.
It's just my personal philosophy is
Yeah.
not the exit, is how to keep it sustainable, profitable, and growing within the family. And that's more or less the type of
Yeah.
family business philosophy, and it worked in my case. So that was key, to go from 70% income on print and 30% digital in 2010, so not long ago. So remember, 2007 is when Facebook and Twitter and all those showed up that also disrupted the
Right.
advertising
And it's
industry.
only, yeah, they did. And it's only like 16 years from 2010. So, yes,
Right,
not
very
that long
recent.
ago.
2010, we were 70%, 70 income on print, 30%, 30 on digital. Right now, it's reverse 70% income on digital. But in order to achieve that, there is a lot of innovative changes and industry changes, and not it's not similar to all the media. Depends on the regions, local media, how has evolved. So it's
Right.
tolerance, the tolerance. I mean, you have to learn how to lose money and understanding that that doesn't mean that you have to close if you know that there are way outs. And
Yeah.
history and mentorship is extremely important because that's what gives you the wisdom and educational preparation to understand how the new world it's going. It's the only way to get the right tools to brace for impact because you're going to have the impact, but then also be prepared for the potential opportunities.
Okay, that is exactly what I was looking for. So thank you. I appreciate that. I think that's really great knowledge and advice to entrepreneurs out there. And then this brings me to our last question of the day. So looking ahead, what do you see as the next frontier for Latino media in the US? Are we entering a new era of influence or even language, right? What is next for Spanish speaking Latino media in the US? Looking forward.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. I prefer to be wrong and being optimistic than being right, being pessimistic, right? The being optimistic, the impact of the content of Spanish-speaking media still being underserved, and so I still think that there will be consolidation of technology platforms like Alphabet and Meta and into understanding that U.S. Spanish-speaking media has to be treated as a submarket within the U.S. Still not that. It still is not that way. So I see an opportunity there. And remember, this is the second country in the world with most Spanish-speaking people. So after Mexico, we already passed Argentina, we already passed Colombia, we already passed Spain. And that's not the
Right.
GDP, the economic power of the Spanish-speaking audience in the U.S. is the
Mhm.
size of France. If you put the Spanish-speaking as a country, it's like France.
It's like France.
So
Wow.
the future of Spanish-speaking media, I think, is there with a lot of potential. How is it going to be? If your question goes, how do I envision the Hispanic media in the future? It's very difficult because that's when I will see very similar to what's happening now. Now you see
Mhm.
podcasters, famous podcaster being purchased by legacy media, and you see some legacy media reducing, but you still have New York Times making money, and you still have other media industries thinking about the dilemma of how to evolve, like any industry, I would say. And with AI, everything is evolving so fast that
Right.
I would say that the quality of content of our Spanish speaking responsible media will always be valued by the leaders, political leaders, and technology leaders. Right now, it's still underserved. I mean, you don't see that many tweets of of the new moguls, the Zuckerberg, the Musk, the Bezos. You don't see them talking much about the Spanish speaking market audience right there. Actually, right now we are in
Mm.
the screens every
Yeah.
day with all these eyes and
Yeah.
immigration at least, but we still are very and we're not going to let. I mean, even if they deport 2 million people, we're still 60 million.
60 million strong. I love that. You know what? I actually, I'm just trying, when you mention these things, it kind of just reminds me of certain things I hear on the news and stuff. And a famous artist here from the US, she went to Mexico City, or I think was touring around like Latin America, but she ended up in Mexico City, I think in December. And she started like tweeting or sending messages out in Spanish. And then at the concert, she would sing Spanish songs. So that just reminded me of like how much we want to be seen on an individual level, and like you saying there's still an opportunity to cater to this community that is second largest Spanish speaking community in the world, right? In America, and our great leaders or even famous individuals are not catering to this massive economic power force that we have here, right? And so yes, no, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. I mean, and the future could look at it could we don't know what it's going to look like, but we didn't even know social media was going to be a place where you promote your business. And 2026, if you're not promoting your business on social media, like what are you really doing now, right? So who knows what would come 5 years from now, or what the new platforms are, especially with AI. So I know AI right now is all the rave, and I'm using it almost every day now, where last year and the years before, I wasn't using it at all in my business as well. Looking forward to the future. But thank you, Javier, for joining the show. I know that you have a lot of valuable information in the book, so people should go out there. The book is called Live from America, How Latino TV Conquered the United States. And that was written by you, Javier Marin. You're the author of the book. So again, thank you so much for coming on the show, and hope to have you back sometime soon.
Randy, it was fun, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. Please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and share this podcast with your network. Your support helps our Latinx business community grow stronger with every listen, and I truly invite you to connect with us. Send us your questions, your comments, or even your own business stories to randy@rgtaxes.com. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, keep learning, keep building your business, and keep growing your business mindset.